This is Coffee with Kelly, a dynamic podcast that's dedicated to driving positive change in school safety. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kelly Moore, Senior School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. Our mission is to empower you with essential knowledge, tools, and inspiration required to foster a safer and more secure school environment. We hope this podcast will be the catalyst for transformation in your schools. Join us as we continue to dive into the world of school safety. Good morning, Kelly.
Yes, it is, Ethan. Fantastic morning.
Yeah?
How are you doing?
Well, I went to go make coffee and I don't have any more beans. So I don't have coffee right now. I might have to go get some more after we're done with this, but so I've no mug. I have this imaginary mug with me today.
So let me get this straight. We've been on a podcast for 18 months.
Sure.
The vast majority of what we're talking about is planning and being prepared, and you come to Coffee with Kelly without coffee?
Yep.
Huh? Okay. I just want to make sure I got that. Yep. I got that straight.
Oh man. My voice is might sound a little bit different, but getting over pneumonia, not recommended. I'll put it that way.
No, it's not. Yeah, you gotta be careful with that stuff.
And then they were like, it was funny. One of the antibiotics they gave me, they're like, just so you know, when you take this, try not to go out in the sun too much, because you're more likely to burn. And I'm like, you do see me, right? Do you think I'm someone who spends a lot of time outside in the sun? I'm pretty white. I'm pale pasty white.
My pale little man. So what are we going to talk about today? Huh?
Well, you were telling me earlier we're talking about, if I can say this word, I always screw it up. You were wanting to talk about vulnerabilities. There you go. Gotta enunciate that word.
Right. More precisely, assessing your vulnerabilities, right? In this initial part of the 24-25 school year, we decided we were going to sort of follow the Zero Now pathway to safer schools sort of model that they're putting out. So this is the second step of that. The last podcast we did was building your teams and starting with your school safety directors and that kind of stuff, trying to get everything, that strong foundation built. And then the second step of that is assessing your vulnerabilities. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we're going to go today.
Where do you start in this process? Do you start on the inside? Do you start on the outside? Do you start with your people, your systems, and your policies?
What you just said, right? So part of your vulnerabilities is, do you have the policies to drive what you're doing, right? If you set up your team properly, you set up policies properly, your systems and processes, and then that'll dictate how your people will sort of fall in line, right? So when your first step is really, do I have sufficient policy to drive what I want to get done? Are they enforceable? Can they hold people accountable to what I need to do? And if not, then do I need to create a policy to fortify my efforts, to support my efforts, right? And the reason I say that first step is looking at the policies is because, we talked about the three pillars. And if you don't have all three pillars in balance, and again, we're talking about policies, people, systems, or processes, however you define that. But you really need to make sure when you start doing your assessments, regardless of what kind of assessments, and we'll get into like the top four or so, there's lots of assessments that we do in the safety realm, but really, if you don't have the policies that support those, you need to get those in order first. You need to start talking to your administrators, seeing what they're willing to enforce, what they're willing to hold people accountable for. Because if you're not willing to hold somebody accountable, then that policy is no good, right? You can have the best policies out there, right?
We had talked about a pretty interesting news thing that happened a little
Uh,
while ago. You
sure, you can
want me
bring
to
that
bring
one
that one
up,
up?
or the clothing thing that we brought up yesterday, if you saw that. That was yesterday.
Oh, was that recent? The clothing thing?
That came out yesterday.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah, let's talk about that one. That was maybe a little bit
Either way,
more
we can do
interesting, I
both.
guess. Well, they're both pretty interesting.
Time is
But
cheap.
all right, I'll do both since you gave me the option.
Okay.
I'll do both. I'll start off with
Uh-huh.
the more funny one, I guess. Um, so I'm trying to think of when it was.
It's a couple
I
weeks
mean, it
ago.
was fairly
Mm-hmm.
recently, maybe a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago or something. The article came out, anyways. But this actually started during 2020,
Mm-hmm.
during the whole COVID pandemic era. Apparently, it was a director level. It was like a nutrition
Mm-hmm.
director or something for a school. They found out that she had basically been stealing chicken wings by buying chicken wings through the school's budget, and it was valued at $1.5 million.
That's that's some chicken wings,
That's
right?
that's crazy. And so she had been doing this for like 3 years.
Yeah. When I when I did the
So they
math,
didn't know that she was doing this for 3
yeah,
years.
and
Oh yeah, remember you
we
you
did
did
the
the
math.
math in like how many
It
boxes?
was
It was like
like
what, 72,000?
it was a lot. Yeah, it was close to 80,000 boxes, or something like that of chicken wings. Yeah.
They did some audit or something. I can't remember what they some other person in the school was looking at something, and the only reason why they caught it was because it was like a they usually don't order chicken wings with bones in them.
Why?
Usually they order boneless
Why?
because it's like a hazard. It's a choking
Small
hazard.
small children with bones
So
is not a good mix, right?
yeah, not ideal. So, but this person was ordering with the bone in.
Mm-hmm.
What she was doing with them, I haven't figured that one out. But that's the only reason why they found out. Now she's probably gonna spend like 9 years in prison or something.
Ish, right? Because it's depending on the funds that were used for that, right? There's a lot of federal programs for food. So you're talking federal money. And if it's federal money, then it's a federal offense versus a local offense, but or a state offense. Either way. It, and I guess some people are asking, well, what does that have to do with school safety, and why do we care about $1.5 million in chicken wings? Right? It's a good story. It's a fun story, but and you say, what the hell, right? But it really is. We're talking close to 4 years now that this has been going on, and the processes were not in place to, one, identify this much earlier, and two, to hold people accountable for what they were doing. And and I realized, I think she was the director of nutrition for a relatively large school, right? Having those kind of audits, you'd think they would have audits like that pretty regularly,
Yeah.
Like
Quarterly.
like I told you, we used to do at the sheriff's department quite a few fundraisers, and there were many of us. I was part of that team that used to barbecue for special events for the sheriff's department that was doing fundraisers for various. Sometimes they were youth groups, sometimes it was for the sheriff's department and equipment that we needed. In order for us to get the best price for the food, we went to a commercial vendor and we used the jail's account for the purchase of that food because they would get a better price. But we were limited on what we could buy. We had to get permission if we went outside of that. And if we went beyond certain quantities, we had to notify somebody, hey, we just bought, just as an example, 100 pounds of meat. That's not enough for the jail, but it's too much for a single person, right? So they want to know that kind of stuff, right? There were safeguards in place even through the vendor. The vendor would say, yeah, we can't sell that to you. Why not? Because it was set up in the parameters as a safeguard when ordering for the jail. That particular cut of meat is too expensive, or it's not something that they use. So it was off their list, right? So they only had certain things that you could buy, and we were buying stuff that they don't normally buy. And so they said, well, we have to call the food service director. And we were okay with that because they knew what we were doing and why we were doing it. If they didn't, we just got on the phone with them and explained it to them. But the point is we couldn't, even if we wanted to, I couldn't go in there and buy 50 pounds of meat for my backyard barbecue without somebody saying, this doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
And that's my point, is there were safeguards in place. They held people accountable for that. I mean, the reality is we never imagined that we could get away with it. We weren't trying to get away with it, but we knew that there were safeguards in place, and we didn't even try, to push those limits. We just did what we needed to do, and if it set off some alarms, then we addressed it, and everything was fine. That doesn't seem like it's the case here. And when we're talking about school safety, are we talking about, are you doing your drills? Are you doing your training? Or is everyone participating? Is everyone engaged sufficiently in the processes, the drills, and so forth? And are you spending your limited dollars appropriately, right? At one point, and I'm not going to name the district or the person, but there was one superintendent after a tragedy that was sued because of lack of or inappropriate actions during the tragedy. But after, he was indicted because they did an audit of his safety systems and the money that he was provided. And it turns out he inappropriately moved money around. He was using safety money for something else. So, we have a limited amount of dollars. And when somebody's inappropriately using it or moving it to somewhere else to support some other program or something, then that hurts us all. And we need to have processes in place to prevent that and hold people accountable for that. Now, the clothing.
The clothing. Everyone's like, what about clothing? So there was
Clothing. Yep.
I guess a recent policy that a school or school district had put out, and it was around that. I don't know if it was just,
turns out it was a school within a large school district.
okay,
A single
school. I don't know if it applied to everyone or just the students, but they can no longer wear black.
What's their justification behind that? Do you remember?
I can't remember specifically. I don't think I'm going to say it correctly. You knew a little bit more about this than I did.
What ended up happening was And under the right intentions, a school district, I think it was a middle school or maybe a K-8, but let's call it a middle school.
Okay.
In the interest of safety, they decided to ban the color black. And while nobody said it in the article, there was some clarification, I guess, from somebody who made a comment that said, this isn't, it's all black. You can't wear all black. But they specifically show types of clothing you can't wear, right? The ironic thing is their school colors are green and black, right? But you can't wear black.
No way. Is that
Their
real?
justification. Yep.
Oh my goodness.
Yep. Yep. The justification was the color black has a bad connotation to it. It indicated that your school might have a high, this is according to the article, right? That you might have a higher crime rate, but it also indicates that the people who have depression and exhibit concerning behaviors showing red flags, that wearing black is a red flag. So they decided to ban it. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and then I'll give you mine.
Well, I think I did have this thought, and I think someone had mentioned it within our group. They actually state that wearing black could be an indicator of something underlying, right? And so now they're going to remove that indicator. So now they're actually going to make it a little bit harder to identify, or even like if that's the indicator and you're removing it, then you're making your job harder to spot things that might not be right.
That's true, right? But you're eliminating what might be an indicator, might be an early warning sign,
right?
And by eliminating that sign, you're not eliminating the cause for that sign. You're just eliminating the result. So you're making it harder to identify whether or not you need to focus on that individual, right? Obviously, if you paint everything with a broad brush and you say everybody is, and this is an easy approach, wearing black causes these problems. So, or people who wear the black have a tendency to have these issues or cause these problems. So we're going to remove the black. And are we going to remove the problem? It's silly, right? It causes so many other issues because there's a lot of people who like wearing black. It's easy. Does black give you a feeling of power?
No.
Maybe it's a strong color. It doesn't. But I mean, it tends to, look at the Raiders football team. Look at their following and the fact that they're black and silver, right? Black and gray. It's also a lot of the gangs wear that color. So you could say, well, let's remove that. But you don't remove the gang membership from the person. You don't remove the tendency to participate in gang activity. You take the shirt off, but you don't change the person or address those issues, and you're not solving anything. And you're creating more problems that don't really need to be around. Like, why can't I have a choice? Why can't I do this? So the point is that we're always looking for this easy way out, and we look at these surface level things that we associate with a certain type of behavior, yet we're not addressing the underlying behavior. And therefore, if we're not addressing the underlying behavior, it's stereotyping a color, a clothes, right?
Yeah.
A color of clothing. And
that's true.
You're trying to say, well, how do you stereotype a color? Well, you associate a color with a small minority or a group of people who have issues. What does that do? I'm just asking for a friend, right? What is, I mean, you're stereotyping a color and you're saying if you wear black and you're trying to identify if you wear black, you have mental health issues or you're a gang member or you cause problems. As opposed to, in the example that I used in the discussion that we had yesterday, was okay, I'm colorblind. It's easier for me to match colors using a color and black.
Right. You can
I wear black a lot.
wear a black shirt and then whatever color your pants are, it's probably going to work.
It's going to work, right? Or vice versa, right?
Yeah.
Black pants and whatever. And having that kind of reaction to a color of clothing is misdirected, I think. I think you get where I'm going with that, right?
Yeah.
And let's address those behaviors, not the kind of clothing they're wearing, you know. And frankly, this fight was fought and lost in California about gang attire and wearing gang attire. If it's specifically identifiable as gang attire, that's prohibited.
Yeah.
But people who tend to wear a certain color, whether or not they are associated with a gang, you can't ban them from wearing, like back in the day it was red and blue, right? The Crips and Bloods. And so you can't specifically ban that. You can't specifically ban like outlaw motorcycle colors. It's a freedom of expression, a freedom of speech, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's so the problem here is the not only did they do this, the school implemented it and communicated with all the parents, started an uproar, and the district says, "What are you guys talking about?" They never got it approved through the district. The individual schools have the ability to set their own code. What do they call it? Clothing code, dress code. You tell I'm getting older. Dress code. They can set their own based upon what their community wants. But if they're going to ban something or do something that is specific, they have to get it approved by the district, and they didn't. So it's likely not going to go anywhere because I think they probably had the same kind of concerns that we're expressing here.
Yeah, probably. Overall, it's just silly.
Yeah, that's if you look at the pathway to violence or the pathway to academic success, which I often refer to, they're paralleled on a lot of the behaviors. And this is probably some of what they used is, but there's a slight difference here. If somebody starts and changes their appearance and they are typically wearing bright, colorful, what I'm going to, in air quotes, because I know this isn't a thing, normal clothes, right? Everyday school clothes that would be expected by every other kid to wear without any issues. And then all of a sudden they change and they're wearing tactical gear, then that's concerning.
Yeah.
But here's the deal. Tactical clothing can be black, oftentimes is, but so can blue, so can green, so can all of these other gears. It's the functionality of the clothing, not the color of the clothing. The color of the clothing in tactical gear is dependent on your environment that you're working in. It could be white if you're working in the winter. It's the functionality, not, and to say somebody they go from wearing blue jeans and endless summer t-shirts and bright colored clothing to wearing black, and all of a sudden they're on our radar, is inappropriate. You need to understand the context of the change or the context of why somebody is wearing that. It's just one piece of information in a brick that has 1,000 walls or a wall that has 1,000 bricks in it.
It's good way of putting it.
Right. Assessments.
So we kind of talked about
second step.
People a little bit. Is that kind of where you're going with it? Is the 3 pillars? You look at it from the 3 pillars, or is there a different way of looking at assessing your vulnerabilities?
So we start by looking at the policies, right?
Okay.
And we look at how those are fortified and how we can address our vulnerabilities and having the policies there. So when we talk about building a strong safety program, we talk about having a balance in those 3 pillars, right? And so policies is one of them, people, systems, those types of things, processes. In your chicken wing article, we're talking about systems and processes that are there so something bad doesn't happen, right?
Yes.
So it's the same type of a process. And I want to say this, because I answered this question in a chat room the other day about, does anyone have the question was something to the effect, does anyone have a policy that says that you should do this, this, and this in an emergency? Well, policies typically don't lay that out. Policies typically say you must abide by the checklist. You must abide by the safety plan. That way you can change the safety plan without going through all of the formal processes for changing and adopting a new policy. It's much less formal process. And you can go up to the superintendent, make a change and say, hey, I made this change and this is why I made this change. And the superintendent can go, okay, that makes sense. Approved. And moved on when you have a plan or a safety program. Whereas the policy says, according to policy number 1.1.3, you shall follow the school safety program and its recommendations. So that's what we're talking about there. When we're talking about vulnerabilities, we often think of really how is somebody going to get into the building. So we're talking about physical vulnerabilities, but in a solid safety program, we really there's lots and lots of assessments, and our assessments are meant, we call them vulnerabilities, but what we're really looking for are gaps in our systems, right? And our processes, our people. And we might see vulnerabilities in our infrastructure, right? But what we're really talking about is the process of assessment. And there's about four or five what I would call main assessments that we're talking about. We could add 100 of them, like I said, but it's really about establishing the assessment process. And the assessment process starts with, what do you want your program to look like? If money, people, training, time, all of these obstacles that we always hear about, if they weren't there, what would it look like? What would your ideal safety program, security program look like? Once you've established what your dream would be, now we go walk through the building. And if you said, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but if you said, I need 150 cameras, they need to be strategically located throughout the building, right? So that's your plan. That's what you want in your dream scenario. So now you walk through the building and you assess the functionality, placement, and whatever are they working type of every camera that you already have. And then you say, okay, I now have 75 cameras. I need 150 cameras. So that's a vulnerability. Now you need to devise a plan to get the other 75. At the same time, you're maintaining, and if you need to replace the 75 that you currently have. So you're identifying the gap of the 75 that you're missing, But the other vulnerability is if those 75 cameras that you put in there were put in 15 years ago and they're coming to the end of their lifespan, do you actually have 75 cameras? Right? And if you want your cameras to have the ability to be accessible during an emergency, so they're cloud based or web based or whatever that technology is, and none of your 75 cameras do, you actually need 150 cameras, right? And what are you going to do in the meantime? Are you going to replace all 150? Likely not, because that's expensive. So what's your plan to get to the 75? Maybe you have a 3-year plan where you're putting an extra 25 cameras in, and you're planning on replacing the other cameras, and your experiences are you're going to lose 10 of those a year. And so
Yep.
when you identify those 75 and you replace 10 of those a year. So now you're buying 35 cameras every year for the next cycle, budgeting cycle or whatever. That's what we're really, from an overview, that's what we're assessing. It's process improvement. It's systems improvement. It's about looking at your people, your processes, your systems that we've talked about, your policies. So assessing your vulnerabilities, let's expand the vulnerabilities from just security into the safety program, systems, processes, people. Are you training them frequently? Right? Your drills, are you doing those effectively? Are you doing your after action reports? Those kinds of things. But so that's kind of the overview of what we're talking about today.
With policy, it'd be kind of interesting to assess a vulnerability there, because it's almost like you don't know what you don't know. Like if you write a policy and you look at it and you go and you honestly think, yeah, this is good. I think we have everything. How do you assess a vulnerability in a policy?
Good question, right? The vulnerability of your policy is tested just like everything else. So you do a drill. And as you're doing your drill, you come up with a scenario. And in that scenario, you start running something. And the policy says, and this becomes direct to that example I gave you where somebody said, does anyone have a policy that tells you you have to do this step, and this step, right? If policy says you have to do step, and you violate that policy, there is potential for discipline. So if you're running a scenario and you have a policy like that, and somebody says you have to do, well, let's take this as an example. The policy says anytime there is a fire truck, police car, or ambulance on campus, you have to notify district administrators. There's good reason for that. We actually had that policy at the district I was at. The reason is that the people nowadays, especially nowadays, they see any one of those types of vehicles on a campus, they think the worst. So phone calls start getting on, and if you don't know, school districts have a little bit of politics going on, right? And the school board members, why is this happening at my school? What blah 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 blah, and they have no idea. So the idea is we need to educate the politicals, the school board, and the administration. You might be getting these phone calls, right? And this is what's happening, so that they can field those questions. Totally get it. But I run a drill and there's not a notification, and I'm running the drill to try to be real life. I'm doing a full-size exercise, let's say, and I have the fire department, the police department, and ambulances all respond, and I am working through the drill and I'm just doing what I need to do, and I forget to call the district administration because policy says I have to. If I don't do that and somebody's calling the district office or the board, I could get in trouble for that. When I'm really trying to do the best thing and I'm trying to figure out this emergency situation and I didn't call. So is that a good policy? I get it. I understand it. But maybe we should say not as soon as they get onto campus, but as soon as we have time to do it. So now we're looking at that policy and we're saying this could be tweaked a little bit, or maybe there's something that we could make it a little bit more workaround. Of course, you know that there's technology out there available that can do that notification for you. So when you press the button, it escalates there.
So you have to be, when you're doing these policies and like you're assessing your vulnerabilities within a policy, you always have to be a creative thinker. You have to be able to think outside the box. You have to be able to think
critical
of all these. Okay, what if this? Mm-hmm. Does my policy still make sense in this situation?
Right. So you run a drill and it's a complete failure. It's a mess. Or you think you're doing it right and you say, you know what, I'm going to have the cops and the fire guys come in and evaluate my drill. And they're going like, what is going on here? There's a couple of things you have to evaluate or assess. Are the failures policy related, training related, or individual? Is the individual who put this drill together doesn't understand what's going on and therefore the whole thing was a mess? If so, can I correct that problem by addressing that individual and getting training there? If everyone is doing the same thing based upon what they believe the expectation is, well, then it's likely a training issue. They weren't trained properly or they were trained incorrectly. As you're going through, and I'll use this, it shall be the policy of the school district to lock every door every hour of the day while you're in session. Common policy, especially nowadays, right? You're much safer behind a locked door until what?
Until help arrives.
Yep. Help arrives and they can't get to you. And all of the people who have access are in lockdown. On the other side of the door. They're in lockdown. And the person who is doing harm is on the other side of the door. So is that a good policy? I'm not saying it's a bad policy, but that's a situation where you're going to have to readdress the policy and include, how do I give people access during an emergency who need to get into it?
Yeah.
Right. So that's a conversation you're going to have to do, but you're going to have to change the policy to allow that to happen. So that's a policy issue, right? So this is all about process improvement. It's your assessments are always, they're evolving. It's one of those we call safety cyclical for a reason, because it keeps on going. It never ends. So every time you do a drill, every time you do have a false alarm, every time you have an actual event, you should be doing an after action review, which is an assessment of the performance. And if it's a false alarm, then it's I call it an unscheduled activation, unscheduled drill, if you will, if it's a false alarm. But you still need to figure out why that false alarm occurred. Is that a training issue? Somebody overreacted. And we don't want to say, oh, you overreacted, don't do that again. We want to say, okay, this happened and you did this, why? Explain it to me so we understand why it happened. And it may have been completely appropriate. And I'll tell you, I told you this example before. we had a little girl at a high school walked out to get her homework, and she saw somebody in the bus loop where the bus drops kids off that had a gun. She immediately turned around, went back, and told the teacher. And of course, they put everything in lockdown, and we dealt with that. It turned out it was a guy who had blown a radiator hose, and he was holding the blown radiator hose, angry, pointed down. It was a J-shaped hose, and it looked like a gun. There's no doubt. If I had seen that on the video, I would have said, that guy's got a gun. False alarm, but appropriate. She did the right thing. She did exactly what she should have done. And so we have to assess those as well. We need to assess the drills. We need to assess the false alarms and the actual activations. And when everyone was saying that was a false alarm, after everything was said and done, I said that was not a false alarm. That was an actual activation. Turned out to be not what we thought it was, but that was appropriate. So we have to assess those, and we have to see whether or not that's a policy thing. And I'll give you one more example. During a similar incident at the same high school, trust me, this high school had its share of issues. We had a similar incident, and the superintendent was pissed. And he asked me, he said, "Hey, Kelly, you need to talk to your sheriff's guys." I said, "What about?" He says, "They wouldn't let me in. They wouldn't let me go through the roadblock. And that's my school. I need to get there." I says, "First of all, I don't need to change them. They're doing exactly what they were told to do, not to let anyone in. Second of all, you don't need to be there. I need to be with my people." "No, you don't. You need to be available so that if I need help, I can call you and you're in a position where you can help." And reality is, even though we weren't a large district, we're a sizable district. Does everyone know who the superintendent is? Yes. But do they want him walking up and down the halls in the middle of an emergency? No. No. And I'll tell you, here's the other thing, right? I was a lieutenant for a long time at the sheriff's department. I was a commander. And unless somebody was driving recklessly, they were driving in a way that they were going to get somebody hurt, I didn't pull somebody over. You know why? It wasn't because I was lazy. It was because when a commander or a lieutenant pulls somebody over, it's disruptive to the rest of the guys. They're like, "Oh my God, the lieutenant's out there pulling somebody over. This is going to go bad one way or the other. I'm either going to get stuck with it, or he's going to screw it up, or something is bad," right? And so it's disruptive. So don't do that. So let's change that policy. That's all I'm saying. Let's put your efforts and your willingness to work, let's put them somewhere else. There's 3 or 4 primary assessments that we should be doing. Some people focus on one or the other more than, again, balance is the key here, right? What we're talking about is a security assessment, a safety assessment, a policy assessment, threat behavior assessment, and your after action reviews. All right. And when we're talking about those, those 4 or 5 primary assessments, people often interchange a safety assessment and a security assessment as being the same thing.
Yeah.
And security and safety are 2 different things. And so I want to make sure that we understand the differences between specifically those 2. A security assessment is just that. Assessing the security of your building, access to your building, and making sure the right people are allowed in and the wrong people are prohibited from entering that building. And whatever that means to you, there's lots of organizations, PASS, Partnership, the Partner Alliance for School Safety, I think is what it stands for. It's called PASS. They're worried about the security, right? And implementing what they call CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, CPTED, pretty common deal. But it's assessing your vulnerabilities with your infrastructure, your access, and early warning systems, and those types of things. Security assessment. Safety assessment is how safe are you? If you have something happen, what are your capabilities and what is your competency for responding to that? How prepared are you? How well are you functioning in the realm of prevention and mitigation? Safety, right? Different than, because you can be safe and not be secure, and you can be secure and not safe. So they're independent of each other. To have a solid program, you have to be strong in both of those. Goes back to, I can make your school look like a prison, but if somebody leaves the door open, we're not safe, right?
Yeah.
Or if somebody violates the policy and they allow somebody who shouldn't be in, then we're not safe. We can have safety. We could be safe, because safe is a subjective definition defined by the individual, what that means. And so we can have safe if you have everyone working together and still have an open campus. You can have both high level of safety, high level of security, and still have a failure of both of those. So how do we respond? How do we mitigate, and that type of stuff, right? Threat assessments and behavior assessments. Everyone knows what those are maybe by definition, but we really don't know how to use that. We don't know how to put things into context. So we need to understand the threat assessments, because those are the things that are early warning, prevention, mitigation efforts that we should have in place to help with the safety and security, right? Providing a supportive, positive environment is supporting those three objectives that we have, our parents have, our communities have, of getting our kids to school safely while they're there, providing them a safe, secure environment with supportive measures in place. At the end of the day, getting them home safely. Those are the three primary objectives. They don't care how you do it, right? Yeah. They don't care, as long as you can meet those three objectives. I want you to educate my kids in a safe, supportive environment. I want to be able to get my kids there safely, and I want them to return home a better person at the end of the day. So what that means to you is for you and your community to determine. And then that final one is that after action. That's the process improvement, understanding every action that you're taking and then working through that. So there's lots of different assessments that we can be doing. And every time you're trying to improve a process, you have to first understand what you want your process to look like, assess where you're at within that process, identify the gaps within that aren't working correctly for you, or aren't there, and then what are you going to do to correct that, right? So we talk about the problem solving model, right? Process improvement model, assessment model. They're all coming down to the same thing. If you understand your process improvement, you understand your problem solving, you understand how to do security assessments, you understand how to do safety assessment, you understand how to do threat management, and you also understand how to do your after actions. You just have to do it in the context of each of those.
Simple.
What are you
talking about? assessments from a school, and I'm like, Kelly, I do my assessments like quarterly with an hour meeting.
Uh-huh.
Is that enough?
Could be.
Is there a recommended? Could be, because it
Cadence.
depends on the.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on if you're looking at your annual review, right, of
Mhm.
your program, and people are asking for what's the cadence. I think Texas is like every 3 years is required, and
Every 3 years.
yep, I think that's what it
That's a
is.
long time.
I could be wrong in that, so if I'm wrong, somebody shoot me a comment or a "You're wrong, Kelly." I'm okay with that. But I think it's Texas that requires review and submission of a new plan every 3 years.
So
The
like,
problem is 3 years is a long time to
that's a long time.
wait to do an assessment. The other problem is
Wow,
there's other assessments that the state of Texas requires that you do every week,
that seems too much.
right? So you have to assess. They call it a door lock check, right? You have to check every door to make sure it's locked because they've had issues with schools being left open. So from that perspective, you got to find that balance. Here's my recommendation. It's like everything else. There's no hard and fast rule. You have to do it this way. My recommendation
Yeah.
is you should review your safety and security plans and programs annually, at least annually.
Yep.
But don't forget every time that you're doing something within or that touches your safety or security or threat assessment or after action, every time that you do that, that's an assessment. And that's an opportunity for you to improve. So you do a fire drill
Mm.
and you find out that your fire drill is not working, make note of that. Have a process in place that you can make recommendations for change and then follow through and add that change, if it's accepted, add that change into your plan during the annual review so that you can change it officially, get everything done, and then you can look at the training in the upcoming year when you're doing your annual training and your refresher training and your remediation training. So it's a continual process, but you have a formal time frame in which you should be pushing everything together. And I mean, you can change something on the fly by adding directives to your plan. As an example, most everyone who's listened to me at all understands my position on automatic evacuations during a fire alarm. Right? Everyone gets up for last 75 years. Everyone's been getting up and lining up against the wall, marching out to the evacuation assembly area. Not necessarily a good plan in today's. Am I saying don't do that? It's up to you guys. But if I'm in charge, that's
Yeah.
not the plan. I want to do a quick assessment. Is there actually a fire? Where's the fire if there is one? And do I need to actually evacuate if you have multiple buildings and the fires in two buildings over? Do you actually need to evacuate? I don't think so. So you do that, sort of look, listen, and feel, and do that. But if your policy says that you shall evacuate, and in some areas it's mandated by code, by law, that you do these drills and you do it this way because that's what the fire department wants you to do, then you got to do it. But we can say, with a directive, this in today's day and age, this is not the right procedure. Let's change it to let's determine whether or not there is an actual fire. Let's determine whether or not I actually need to evacuate. And better yet, let's make sure that there's not somebody out shooting and planting explosives in some act of violence right outside my door, and that I'm not bringing these that fire alarm wasn't pulled for the purpose of targeting victims, right? And I can add that directive to the current procedure from this day forward. This is our new procedure. Let everyone sort of digest that for a little bit. And then at the review time, that directive gets added to the new plan for the following year.
Gotcha.
So there's ways to do that. And to hold something for 3 years is a little bit long for me. 2 years is too long for me because there's just so many changes.
You get new people, new stuff.
New people, new stuff. Technology, frankly, is moving faster than the speed of people. And
Yes.
if you wait 3 years, you're likely. I've been with Crisis Go for 4 years, and the technology that we use today looks nothing like the technology we used 4 years ago when I came to the company. It's just different, and there's so many things that are out there. Panic buttons are different. AI is being introduced in everything that we can do. It's just moving so rapidly that the old technology, while it may have been good, and panic buttons is a perfect example. I'm all for Alyssa's Law. I think it's great, but the original iteration of that was old technology. It's still old technology. They're still requiring people to put a panic button mounted to a wall. What if you can't get to that wall? What if you can't get to that spot? What if the act is occurring outside or away from you, and let's say it's happening on the football field and nobody's calling you to press the panic button, right?
Yeah.
So what if it's happening on a bus? What happens? What's your policy if you have an emergency on the bus? You have a code. I don't think that's correct, but there's technology that's available to treat a bus like a moving classroom. So why are we not radios? I don't know. Do you want the bus driver, while he's driving around picking up kids, and a kid comes up to you while you're in it and says, "Hey, little Matthew at the back of the bus has a gun. Do you want him to get on the radio and start talking to a dispatcher while he's driving and trying to figure out what he's supposed to do with little Matthew who's showing a gun at the back of the bus? What is he supposed to do? Have that, and the technology's out there. Literally, we can treat a bus like a moving classroom. So if you're waiting 3 years to add that to your policy, that's 3 years that you're rolling the dice on whether or not you're going to have an incident in your school district, and you're waiting for it's 3 years. I'm not mandated to do this. Well, that's silly. It's a silly. You know how I feel about mandates.
Yes.
We shouldn't need mandates, right?
A couple times before.
Mandates are. I get it, but if there's a mandate, you should. If it's in Florida, let's say they have a mandate of Alyssa's Law, you should look at that mandate and see if the intent of that mandate has any bearing, or bearing on your school and your district. And then you should take it and say, you know what, we don't have a mandate, but this is good policy. Let's do it. Why are we waiting for a mandate? Okay, I'm off my soapbox on that.
That's a whole nother podcast, Kelly.
Oh my gosh. You can talk to me till you're blue in the face. But we don't have a mandate. That's the silliest thing that I've ever heard about the safety of our kids. I'm not saying every mandate's good.
It's like a parent having to tell a kid what to do.
Yeah.
Like you shouldn't be told to keep your students safe.
Right. That's like you telling your wife or your husband, I am mandating you to do the dishes. Hey, why didn't you do the dishes? You didn't tell me I had to. You should know that when there's dishes in the sink.
I would get a pretty interesting response if I said that.
Right? You didn't tell me. Right? I wasn't mandated to do the dishes.
Oh, man.
It's that silly. Talk to your kids about cleaning their rooms. But you didn't tell me to. Really? The process is the same here.
Yeah,
I didn't tell you had
it
to
really
keep
is.
your kids safe. I'm telling you now, you have to keep your kids safe. I'm looking right at the camera. You have to keep your kids safe. You don't need a mandate to do that.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.